My name is Valentino, who professionally I'm an on-air personality. I host a daily breakfast show at Smooth 98.1 FM Lagos. Also compare both offline and online. So this is my forte, digital media and comparing conferences like this. All right, so welcome to the second part of the conference on disruption and innovation, reshaping education in Africa post-COVID-19. This part is going to be looking at focusing on technology and innovation. And by my calculation, we have about an hour, 30 minutes to go through this. So we're 4 minutes behind time already. But to start us off, I'd like to just lay a few ground rules for this conversation. On the Zoom panel, there are a few options you can use for the Q&A sessions. I think that would be useful for the polls. All participants joining us, welcome from every part of the world. We appreciate you. I see 74 people has already joined. We can have the feature to raise hands. It's there. So while other people are talking, feel free to explore the window. It's actually a very exciting platform. So yeah, you can raise your hands to speak, but that'll come after the panelists speak. We have the moderator, who's Mr. Annie Charles Ayo, or Charles Bassi Ayo. We have panelists today, that's Mr. Professor Aziz El Hajer. If I pronounce your name wrong, please pardon me. Mr. Ade Adekola, Mrs. Aravinda Ram. Hi. We have Mr. Ezekiel Bamigboye. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
I'm not sure if Hajia Nafisa has joined us already, but I saw one Mrs. Aravinda, another Mrs. Aravinda. How many Mrs. Aravindas do we have? Oh, two. Yeah, awesome. And I see you, Mr. Man Soliman. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, so each panelist, Professor Aziz, you have 10 minutes. I think you're going to start after Annie speaks for 5 minutes. We have the Director General of FRCN joining us. I'll just introduce us again in a professional capacity. Professor Aziz El Hajer is a program specialist in the field of educational technologies at ISESCO's Department of Education and is in charge of ICT for education. He's joining us today. Mr. Mansour Liman is the Director General of Federal Radio Corporation of Nigeria, FRCN, from 2016 till today. We also have Mrs. Aravinda Ram is the Deputy Pro Vice Chancellor of Employability and Technology at the Botho University in Botswana. Also joining us today, Mr. Charles Ani Basieyo is going to be the moderator for this session. He's the co-founder of Axiom Learning Solutions Limited, who are the facilitators of this conference.
Good morning from Lagos on lockdown. I hope you're all having a wonderful experience. We have a distinguished panel today. Ravinda representing the SADC, Southern Africa region, calling in from Botswana. Ade with previous Silicon Valley experience and a real tech guru in terms of innovation, and also sits on the advisory, calling in from Lagos. We have Professor Aziz El Hajer, who is dialing in from Morocco, who is going to sort of be a keynote webinar speaker. He leads transformation across the Islamic community world as regards education and technology. We have Dr. Man Suleiman, who is in charge of the Federal Network of Radio. Radio was a conversation in last week's webinar, which focused more on policy and leadership. So I thank you all, and obviously Mr. Ezekiel Bamigo, who's one of our partners in MTN. It's interesting and instructive that we start this morning on this note. Countries around the continent are beginning to ease or planning to ease restrictions of lockdown. And we now move into the conversation of how can technology and innovation assist the education ecosystem post-COVID, during and post-COVID. One of the things that came out of last week's webinar, which was focused on policy and leadership, was that we need policy and leadership to be more cohesive and consultative. We also sort of all agreed as a consensus, as it were, that that leadership should be at the national level. should be at the subnational level, and also should be evident at the school levels where parents, children, and school leadership interact. So that was something that's very instructive that came out of that session. We spoke a lot about technology last week, but then even though it was a conversation around policy and leadership, it showed that technology was more or less emerging as a key instrument to effect policy and leadership for education. And in today's conversation, we'll be focusing more on technology as a real thing and looking at the innovation. We know this is a disruption, and in a disruption, we must do two things. We either sit back and watch, or we begin to innovate. So that's going to be a lot of conversation. There's going to be a lot of conversation about that today. During last week, we had about 497 participants from 35 countries around the world. Most of those countries were in Africa. However, we had a lot of representation from the United States, from Southern Europe, Greece, Germany, Spain, Portugal, etc. But it's good that we're having conversations for Africans by Africans, while learning from what peers are doing in Asia, Americas, and Europe. So I really want to encourage our panelists. I'm going to just throw some questions out there. And when you do your presentation, try to speak through those issues. One of the issues, perhaps if I may direct that at Mansu, I know your presentation comes further on, it's about radio. And I'm not asking you to answer the question now, but note it and make sure your presentation somewhat addresses it. There's been a lot of conversation around affordability and the ability of light, electricity. And we want to see how radio can help us in that particular dimension. So that's something I'd like you to really talk to. For Ade, you worked in Silicon Valley, you've led a lot of companies in tech, in energy, downstream, upstream, and you've been involved in strategy. We have a lot of people on this call who are not just academia, they're policymakers, and they're also tech inventors and innovators. Perhaps you could sort of hit the issues of how to innovate in a pandemic. I want you to sort of address those concerns, because a lot of people have ideas, but may not know how to innovate. Aravinda, you're calling in from Botswana. You're a Pro-Vice Chancellor of a large university with campuses across 4 Southern African countries: South Africa, Lesotho, Malawi, I think Namibia and Botswana. I might have mixed one of the countries there. But it would be interesting when you give us experiences of how it works for you to kind of not just talk about Southern Africa. This is a Pan-African conference, so you could glean foreign experiences from the other 3 parts of the continent, West and Central, North and East. So we've launched the polls. We have polls that are being answered, and the questions will be the answers to the polls will be shared later. One of the first questions is, do you think tech firms are responding appropriately to the needs of Africa? And so far, what I'm seeing is that it can be better. What areas lack the application of technology? We're seeing people saying it's really assessment, but assessment is almost running at tie with learning. Assessment is 41%, it's still moving. Do you think governments in Africa are concerned about developing technology to enhance education? So the conversation is, it can be better. So that shows that people are actually positive. People are not complaining. People are seeing that there is a demand and to make a change. And I think that's beautiful. So we should sort of encourage that in our conversations. Do you think technology in education will affect positively the education of early year learners? And largely, I'm seeing a yes there. Do you think technology will positively affect the education of special education learners? Largely, I see a yes. So these polls have not completed yet. I think we have 50% voted. We'll leave the polls running and share the final results later. I now give the floor over to Professor Aziz El Hadja, a very close professional. He's calling in out from Rabat. I hope you have beautiful sunshine in Rabat, and although the beaches are there, you can't really go out. So perhaps you could take over now with your keynote presentation. Thank you, Aziz. Over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so delighted to see you, Charles. How are you? Yeah, it's great, and today it's really very sunny and fine to go swimming. But as you know, we are in quarantine, so we cannot go outside, apart if for urgent matters. I'm working from home, but yesterday I was at office almost the whole day for some urgent matters. Anyway, let's start. I'll share my presentation. Okay. Is it okay? Can you see it? Can you see my presentation? Okay, let's start by giving some to know each other. Yeah, I'm Aziz Elagir. I'm working in an international organization which is based in Morocco. It has 55 member states, and I will give you later a small presentation, a 1-minute presentation about our organization, so that you can know what we are doing in this. I call it the little sister of UNESCO, because we are doing the same thing, almost the same thing. So here is the presentation of ICSCO. It's a 1-minute presentation. So it's an expertise hub, access of development, but also we are present in the 54 member states all over all the countries, and we are capacity building, company advocacy, networking, support, especially for different countries. Anyway, let's now switch to what is doing ICSCO to support international community to face COVID-19. So since the COVID pandemic was set in the world, ICSCO has launched many important initiatives. The most important one is ICSCO Prize for fighting novel coronavirus, which it's almost $200,000 for the prize. In response to World Health Organization's appeal to the international community to resize every opportunity to help contain, delay the spread of this virus, ICSCO launches its prize for fighting the novel coronavirus COVID-19. But also, it has launched several initiatives that we call ICSCO Digital Home. It's now 7 initiatives. It's a set of different initiatives strongly supporting international, but especially for our community in member states to help them to grab the coronavirus effects. I will talk about initiatives related to education and technology. So what is ICSCO doing to support education in member states? The first initiative, it's about, as you know, many students are not attending schools and universities because of this pandemic, and to enable our member states to ensure the continuity of education and facilitates learning for students. ICSCO is presenting a branch of links, 3 open source educational applications with different languages. We have some kind of partners with some universities that they have given their content freely to every student. We also have done some special initiative for, especially for African countries. We are translating different documents related to this pandemic to Hausa, to Swahili, to Mandingo, to Fulani, to Wolof. I think almost 15 or 20 African language, local languages that we are translating to support member states through the provision of documents in local languages. The other important initiative is providing smart equipments and materials. In this initiative, ICISCO is giving for almost 30 countries a budget of $400 to support them through the provision of equipments, especially mobile equipments to record, to produce materials for learning for students for different levels and cycles in education. We are also providing an initiative about learning Arabic, because it is the main language that we are using in our company, to learn Arabic at home. Now, I'm sharing with you some ways that coronavirus would reshape education. The first one is that education has pushed everything to change. And this could lead to surprising innovations, as you know. People that are in their home and they have no support from the outside, especially in terms of equipments, how can they continue learning? So this will lead people to innovate. Now, in many countries, we are using radios to be in contact with students and to provide educational materials for them. So this is the first reshape that education will be in the future. The second one is the relationship between private and public sectors. I think they have to strengthen their partnership so that they can help students in their home. We have, for example, in our country, there is a big number of institutions that are private, but now all of them are closed and they need help from the public sector, and they are dealing together now to provide educational support for students. The other one, and I think this is the most important, everybody is talking now about technology, but this technology, I think, will be one of the major to deepen, to widen the digital divide. Are we talking about equity now? People who are in the rural areas, people who have not the equipment to follow their lessons through internet. Are we talking about quality also? I think this is some questions that everybody is taking now to say, how can technology, of course, can solve some problems, but in the other hand, it can be also a kind of problem for other people. And the fourth one is the permanent shift that we are going to have for the online and open education. We have no escape now. We have to be in this kind of giving lessons through internet, through television, through radio, through telephone messaging. Everything is now ready to contribute to this education that have to be open. So this is some ideas I like to share with you, and I will let the rest for the the questions, and thank you for attention.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was short and it addressed quite a lot of things that we believe are emerging in the education ecosystem. Before I let you off the hook, I just want to have a quick thought on assessment. What I'm seeing from our polls are showing that assessment is one area of critical concern. Assessment is one area of critical concern. How do you think that should be addressed? And are there any initiatives at ISESCO to being spearheaded to address the issues of concerns around assessment? Over to you, Aziz, now.
In fact, up to now, we are just, yes, it's a big issue, the assessment and how it can do it. Now, I'm watching the Ministry of Education, as I have been working for almost 30 years in the Ministry of Education. I'm trying to understand how the ministry, if we are, now it's been 2 months that students are in quarantine in Morocco. I'm wondering, as you, how they can assess the students, how they can give marks to students, knowing that they are supported by their parents, by their brothers, and at home. Up to now, I can say I have no idea about how it can be done. If we do it online, it can be really very difficult to have the right marks for students. But face-to-face, now it cannot be done. So perhaps we are going to review the last assessment that has been done in classroom, and depending on each teacher, he can give marks to his students, especially in this situation.
If I may just summarize before I go over to our next panelist, the solutions for assessment need to be grassroots driven. We may not have a one size fits all. We may need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. We look at the United Kingdom, for instance, and they have switched over from assessments, public assessments for the A-levels and O-level GCSE exams. And that is being handled at the school level, where people are building on the profile of the continuous assessment for the children over the last 2 years. I think that's very instructive for us for what some countries are doing and what you're doing in ISESCO. Just a thought there I would like us to take on board is the issue of fairness and equity. Their children, for instance, are learners who perhaps may not have had the luxury of having had good continuous assessment. How do we sort of bridge that gap? And that's something I would like Aravinda to address when I come to you. I think we've spoken a lot. The next person on is likely to be Mansu. Mansu, we've spoken about radio. And you run a network of radio network in the largest country on the continent with 200 million people. And also in a country where we have the greatest out of school children, and if we may say, learning in itself and its entirety was a conundrum before the pandemic came along. Perhaps as you go through your slides, you could just share your presentation, and at the end, just note this concerns, how did radio help before, and is there anything radio can help to do going forward? Your extensive prior position with BBC should help address some of those questions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mansu, now.
Thank you very much, Annie. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm trying to share my screen, if it's possible. Yeah. Okay, so I think I will just start with the basics. The number of students that have been affected by COVID-19, I think in the last count, over 210 countries have closed schools, and then about 1.5 billion children or school students have been affected. That's about 90. That's about, I think, 90.2% of enrolled learners. Now, this is something that is very unprecedented. I mean, in the history of the world, I think we have never seen something like this since the Second World War. Who are affected? The school leavers, mostly Generation Z and Generation Alpha. The Generation Z are the ones that are, I mean, the oldest are about 25 years old. And these are people, I mean, are students that have grown in a truly globalized world. They are media savvy, and they are thinking very much now about their own education. Among them, about 93% of them are very comfortable and they understand technology. 50% of them said they cannot do without without YouTube. You have about 60% of them who would like to collaborate with the rest of, their colleagues in order to solve some of the most pressing world problems like climate change and mental health. For the Generation X, they are they are the ones that actually have, they're children of millennials. Really to them, technology is part and parcel of their way of living. I mean, these are children that probably the oldest of them is about 10 years old or between 8 to 10 years old. I mean, they are not afraid of technology. They are not afraid of touching any button. A 2-year-old person, 2-year-old child, it's actually comfortable holding a tablet and then chatting on video. They are not yet at the stage where they are concerned about their education, but definitely what has happened, this pandemic is going to affect, their way, the way education is, their own education in the future. Now, the solution to, the effect of pandemic on education, the effect is remote learning or distance learning. And different mechanisms to distance learning. It could be online or offline. Online, that's through the internet, and that's what other people have been doing. Offline through broadcast by radio and television, or non-broadcast, that is either by video, you record the video or you record the audio. All of this involves technology, and then technology is going to continue to play an important role in how we deliver education in the future. There are examples across the world of how people have been responding to the pandemic in order to make sure that, education, people are still getting some form of education at the moment. These examples are through interactive apps. You have an example in a Hong Kong school where a 3-year-old child has been using interactive applications in order to continue learning during the pandemic. And then in China, they actually used television broadcast to make sure that about 120 million children continue their own education. Here in Nigeria, there are some examples of using asynchronous online learning tools, such as reading materials via Google Classroom. And then this is being augmented by face-to-face video instruction. And then you have other examples, all of online learning, like in Lebanon, there are examples where even physical education is being done online. You can imagine doing a physical education online education, but then this is this is how technology is going to continue to play an important role. Now, the delivery mechanisms are two, basically the online and the offline. For the online, where there is a good infrastructure, where the training is there, skills are there, it's very simple, because people can access it. The internet infrastructure is there, and if you have a very good connection, you're home and dry. That's very simple. But then there are problems that are associated with this. I just want to skip through the next slide. Says mobile phones is the same as the internet. If you have the infrastructure I mean, you can do all these things. It's not a big problem. But then you have problems like Professor Aziz was saying about the digital divide, because when you don't have access to internet in many remote areas, many poor families cannot afford even the devices to access, I mean, the internet. And then even if they can afford, if they have the devices, then you have problem with the service itself. Some of the services have not yet reached some remote areas. And even if they do, you do have a problem with the data packages. I mean, the cost of the data packages, because most of the rural, I mean, the people living in rural areas are very poor. So for them to afford is going to be a big problem. And so therefore you are going to create an inequality in the kind of education that children are going to get in these particular areas. So what is the solution for this? The solution is to try and use either television or radio in order to reach people in the rural areas. Now for television, it has a tremendous reach, but then there are also disadvantages to using television. It has a very long tradition, I mean, for instructional purposes. I think still some of the, for us that are still, I mean, living single, I mean, some of the cooking that we learn are through television. I mean, I remember learning so many things, I mean, how to cook basic food through television. So it is an instructional material. But then some of the disadvantages that are involved with television are cost of the television sets itself. I mean, this is unaffordable to very poor families. And then you have the problem of electricity again. When you don't have access to electricity, I mean, it's very difficult to run a television. And then again, for television, there is a problem that is associated with the production cost. I mean, the production itself. You need the skills, and it needs a very, I mean, it's high cost. So if imagine, I mean, if you have a teacher that is going to deliver a lecture through television, you would have to give him some of the skills that is needed in order to do that. And that's going to be problematic. So the solution, I think, is radio. Because one, even in this digitally saturated world, I mean, radio remains the most commonly available and accessible technology across the globe. You have about 90% of households in sub-Saharan Africa, they have access to radio. I mean, this radio could be state-run, it could be private, it could be community radio stations. And then, I mean, it has a long history of being a powerful mass medium for disseminating information. And another advantage is that teachers really need little training in order to, I mean, for the technology in order to deliver their own lectures on radio. It's just a matter of continuing what they are used to do in the classroom, and then of course, just recording the audio and then playing it back. And another thing is that it could be instantaneous, because the broadcast can reach so many wide areas. I mean, especially depending on the kind of radio you have. If you have shortwave radio or medium wave radio, you have a long range of areas that you can actually access, and you don't have the problem of accessibility to rural areas. If you have like a network that, like Radio Nigeria that has here in Nigeria, we pride ourselves to be the largest radio network in Africa, because we have over, almost about 40 FM stations connected on a network at regular times. You can use that. In fact, as I'm speaking to you presently, we're in talks with the Federal Ministry of Education here in Nigeria in order to do some, to take learning materials on radio for students, both the junior secondary school and then senior secondary school. We have not yet agreed on the number of hours, but you can imagine the Ministry of Education is asking us to give them about 9 hours in a day. 9 hours in a day is almost from 6 o'clock to to about 5 o'clock in the evening, which is almost impossible to do that. But then we have to do it because this is a national emergency. We are in talks to see what we are able to do. So the advantages of radio really cannot be overemphasized. Now, the advantages again is that you have interactive radio instructions which could be used to reach students and then parents. You have radio teacher prompts the students to use songs, and then they can participate. It's really very interactive in a way, because what happens is that the radio teacher is going to be giving instructions to the students, and you can have students, you can have the students to follow those instructions. Very interactive in a way. The other thing is that you can also do the interactive audio instructions, which is basically a recording of audio materials and then sending it, which is not live broadcast. That's another way of doing it. But because of the ubiquitous nature of radio, you can play, the audio back. Now, going into, my experience with the BBC, traditionally BBC has used radio for learning purposes. BBC has been running Learning English for a very, very long time, and many people have used that to their own advantage in order to improve or even learn English. The first BBC broadcast for national education program was in 1924. That's as old as radio itself. So there is, in fact, now presently a special unit in the BBC called BBC Learning, and it's been used for learning purposes to children, and then there's also BBC School Radio. So these learning resources for primary, schools, they offer video, audio, downloads, and these are for primary schools, Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, and it involves all different, subjects, music, dance, history, and almost, I think, any subject that you can think of. Now, the future, I think undoubtedly, after the pandemic, the future of education is not going to be the same anymore, because the technology is there, and I think the need is also there, and especially, in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are a large chunk of people who are still not attending schools. I think this is something that I think needs to be explored in order to make sure that that gap is being, is addressed. So I think traditional in-person classroom learning will be complemented, in the future with new learning modalities, from live broadcasts to educational influences to virtual reality experiences. It could become a habit that is integrated into daily routines, a true life style. I think what I call here learning anywhere and then anytime concept must be imbibed in order to make sure that I think we address that situation. But then I think what needs to be done again, I think the skills that are needed, I think are going to be very different again. This is just a table, I think, for reference point. You can see the kind of skills that people will need in the future. Both the students and teachers, in order to make sure that this is very effective. So I'm conscious that I think I've taken more than the time that you have given me, but I think I will wait here. If there are any questions later, I can respond to those questions. So thank you very much.
That was excellent, actually. I really did enjoy that chat about radio. And one of the reasons I find it very relevant to the society we live in is because of those challenges that are evident in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, I'd say a larger part of sub-Saharan Africa. And more importantly, the fact that we need to have a multifaceted strategy in the new world, as it were, where radio perhaps would help solve the problem of digital divide, which is something that is going to be very much at the forefront. When we speak to private schools, they can talk about e-learning, but a large proportion of the Africans that are going to build the society of the 2050 are in the rural areas scattered around Africa. And I think radio could play a very ubiquitous role, as you have rightly said. But before I let you off the hook, I would like you to just share a few, your thoughts around a few things that have sort of emerged. And looking at the sort of conversations in the chat group, One is a virtual reality experience. Perhaps you could take us further through that. I would like to see how, I'd like to understand how that can be enhanced, immersed in a wider digital literacy program. The other thing I'd really like to understand, and I'm seeing a lot of that emerging in the conversations offline and online, is that perhaps radio, it's easy to teach children in preschool, kindergarten age, through music, dance, folklore, to sort of re-establish and reinforce basic learning principles. But when we go up, further up the ladder, perhaps at basic school, basic secondary school, and basic education at the upper end of it, secondary school, where we're doing chemistry, physics, etc. How do we use radio in that instance? But for me, I think what is most concerning is how do we get feedback? Because education needs to be one that you get feedback from the learner. And because radio is sort of, I don't want to call it a propaganda tool because it's not, and that's not what I'm trying to debase it to or reduce it to. I think it's a mass tool. How then do you bring that personalized learning into the conversation? So Mansu, could you just talk about those three things? Personalized learning using radio, that's feedback, talking about virtual reality, which I think is very interesting with where artificial intelligence is going. And then lastly, your concern about assessments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I will start with the, feedback and the feedback mechanism for radio. Yes, radio tends to be one way because when you are talking, I think mostly people are listening, but I think it's actually in the future, what I see is that a combination of, I think, some technologies and radio that you can actually use in order to get that feedback because simple text messages, simple chat, applications can be used for that purpose, for the feedback purpose. When you have people listening, and then of course they can chat back like we're doing now. You can see you're receiving chats as feedbacks from the participants in this group. And this is the kind of thing that, I think I see to happen. And using text messages it doesn't need that much electricity, doesn't need that much data, and is affordable and doesn't need, high-end smartphones in order to do that. I think with small, low-end, mobile telephones, you can achieve that. Now, the second thing is that teaching higher, grade, students, like teaching chemistry and physics and other things, biology, I think it's not impossible because this is what we are trying to do now with the Federal Ministry of Education here. There are instructions that you can actually give for people to follow on radio. All you need is to be doing the instructions and then giving, the instructions, and people can follow. So I don't think it's going to be that very difficult because, when you're doing the radio, you have to do it both the two methods that I've spoken about. That is the interactive radio and then the non-interactive one, in which you have the teacher actually giving instructions on what to do. So I think that's the way I think can be done, and I think it's possible to do that. Now, I think there were three things that you wanted me to talk about.
Virtual experience, we covered that. Virtual reality.
Yes, I think, the virtual reality radio itself, is kind of, it's a virtual classroom kind of, when you're dealing with it. So I think it's something that I think needs to be explored, but I think it needs to be combined with some form of technologies in order to make sure that I think we achieve what we want. It's going to be very difficult, but I think it's not impossible.
Mansur, you did very well. And I really want to say to everybody on the call, please try to share your questions on the Q&A sessions and we'll pick that up. I think what has what we've covered here on radio, it's very, very realistic. And we need to use simple solutions to move forward. And if I look at anything here, perhaps from a business perspective, an innovation perspective, it's looking like radio helps solve that digital divide. But we need to have add-ons over the processes. Add-on maybe in terms of technology to carry on people we've left behind, perhaps like one of the attendees to the conference has just shared, people with hearing impairment, the deaf. How do we use radio to take those sort of groups of learners on board? We've shared here about discrete subjects, you know, things in the science domain. How do we take those people on board? Mansu's chat on virtual reality, I think it's apt and spot on. And a few other people on the chat have shared that it's an opportunity to be collaborative, because people can call into radio to share their experiences. And it's also a very good tool to disseminate into multiple language. And I think this alludes back to what Aziz shared earlier about, you know, for instance, being able to share their initiatives and disseminate in quite a lot of languages across the continent. I think at this point, we're seeing something emerging here. We're seeing that we are being positive, you know, I'll be sharing the results of the poll. We're being positive on how we're trying to address challenges in the education sector. But perhaps we need to be a bit innovative and structured so that our innovation doesn't kind of fall through the cracks, in a way that we can pilot and scale up quite quickly. We're seeing this with the vaccines. We're in a state of rapid testing and agility in the healthcare sector in order to respond to the health challenges of the pandemic. And I think it's only fair enough that at this stage, we're talking about technology, we should encourage a conversation that sort of fosters the same level of agility in the response we would see across incubators, tech companies, the academics, the public and private sector, so that we can, at a very, very quick and short time frame, bring to market solutions that will create equity, fairness, the basic principles on which education thrives. At this junction, I want to call on your expertise, Ade. You know, and in addressing or speaking to your slides, as it were, could you, you know, sort of allude to some of the things the last speaker has shared on radio, and just give us, you know, at the end of your presentation, make it practical in sort of answering, or you could do it before you share your presentation, whichever way you choose, how ideas and concepts can quickly scale up. And, you know, the availability of capital, such as venture capital and funds to help, you know, speed up such activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the conference. Let me start perhaps by trying to address your question or the issue you mentioned with regards to radio. Innovation is something that people come about from a number of perspectives. You know, one is the technical perspective, another is a behavioral perspective of how people's behaviors are changing, and the third is a market perspective, because only those innovations that have the ability to reach the market actually scale up. So looking at radio and the opportunities for innovation around radio as a channel of supplying innovation, the things that come to my mind is what can one combine radio with, such that you can make it a more two-way channel rather than it just being broadcast. For example, I can imagine that you may use SMS in combination with radio such that the students can ask questions. The other things that I can think about is, for example, one can mine the kinds of questions that come up in physicals or in real schools, actual schools, and come up with a question and answer, such that you broadcast a set of questions and answer, so people can, or the students can learn from all those kinds of questions. There is also an opportunity to put artificial intelligence over radio and create new markets. So at that junction, I'll just go to my slides and share my screen. And it's a big ask you've Let me start with, what has been disrupted, right? And COVID has come and it has stopped us in our tracks. And because it stopped us in our tracks, we've had to rapidly respond. It's also important to realize that COVID is not going away anytime soon. So for me, what that means is that the way we innovate out of this particular disruption is to look at the ways COVID will change our particular behaviors. Also, people don't necessarily understand what innovation is. Innovation is not invention. Invention tends to come from a technical perspective. Innovation comes from three perspectives: behavior, technical, and market. Then there are some other big questions around, what is the future of education as a sector, right? There was education before COVID and the models that were produced. And then we've seen the disruption and we've seen the way the institutions have responded in real time to the disruption. There is also education post-COVID, right? And this disruption, in my view, will just accelerate a lot of the changes that we'll see of what people are looking to innovate down the future. So I'm going to address our approach to uncertainty in light of this disruption. It's important to recognize that there is not one market for education, not one size fits all. So if you're looking at educating people at the bottom of the pyramid in rural environments that don't have access to the infrastructure, you will do it a different way than if you are trying to address a market for advanced learners that are technology savvy, your Generation Z. So that's really important to understand which market you are trying to address. Technology trends for education. There are several technology trends also on the horizons, and I will talk about those. And there are also some inherent barriers to innovation, because fundamentally innovation is change. There are some cultures that are very open to change and know how to embrace it. There are some cultures that are very suspicious of change because all they see is a diversion of resources. And if you don't have the right approach to addressing those barriers, many of the innovations, opportunities to innovate may fail. And then I'll make some predictions as to what's on the horizon too. So first of all, let me just start by saying, what is innovation? It's bringing a new idea or a creative thought to market. It's also how do you create better solutions for things that exist today? And a lot of those are process innovations, making things faster, making them better, making them cheaper. And then there's innovation for new requirements, right? So COVID has created a set of new requirements. Now, we don't know how to actually approach solutions given those new requirements until we go into the labs and we start tinkering. And then there are bits of innovation that are really about trends, unarticulated needs that we have. And those are also on the horizon. And are we innovating for an existing market, or are we innovating to try and create new segments in another market? These are important considerations. So let me jump to, right. So, I mean, I view that, we're all participants in this education ecosystem. But however, there are some very, very big questions before we start to kind of enter into the quote unquote lab or processes of design to create, solutions that will create transformation for the sector. So some things you need to answer is, what is the purpose of school? What's the purpose of education? The schooling that I went through, I'm in my early 50s, was predicated on, the Industrial Revolution model. We were trying to create standards, but that's not necessarily the case for schooling going forward. So we need to understand that. There is also a changing role of the teacher, and how do you support the teacher in those new roles? For example, you've mentioned virtual reality. how do you create the mechanism to support the teachers such that they know what's going on in a remote learning environment? How do they monitor the students? How do they assess them? These are all new big questions that we need to think through and we need to create answers for. There's also the essential, how do you discover what students' individual passions are? And is that important in trying to create a new model for innovation? So it's important to understand where we're going to, and we've got to ask these big questions, right? So from my point of view, the answer to those questions is that you've got to understand which segment you're looking at. Are you looking at primary schools? Are you looking at rural education? Are you looking at, advanced consumers of education? But with respect to COVID, what we know is that it has changed the way we will behave. It has changed, or rather in responding to it, our values, our attitudes to education will change. So many of the ideas will come from this behavioral and psychographic categories. And we've got to figure out how to define those segments such that we can create bits of innovation. It's also important to realize that learners themselves are not the same as what they used to be, right? There are kids who've grown up in immersive environments and they understand how to game in a virtual environment. Their approach to learning will be different. And there are people who still rely on paper and the traditional. So we've got to figure out which of these learners we're creating solutions for and how do we create an impact for. With regards to technology itself, there are some things on the horizon and I'll just speed through them. We've already mentioned virtual reality and what I call pervasive technology. And the best example of a pervasive technology is your mobile phone, right? There's so much you can do on your mobile phone if it is a smartphone. Even if it's not a smartphone, and if you look at the classic, SMS-based phones or feature phones as they call them, they're again, multiple opportunities to create, solutions. So we should not look at innovation in education from just a technology perspective, but from other perspectives and how we combine hybrids to create solutions. Artificial intelligence, and it's also a big opportunity on the horizon, and that is, how do, we can create simulations and process simulations to identify opportunities, identify new learning methodologies. So it's something to consider. Remote learning, monitoring and assessment. How do you do that? Through what channel? Is it the radio? Is it the TV? Is it the smartphone? Is it your computer? And other channels to the consumer. Then augmented reality is another technology set that's out there on the horizon, and that is where you can layer virtual information on top of a physical landscape. So the way in which you negotiate your physical terrain also changes. Now, in an augmented reality model, you deliver education on demand because you don't necessarily have to retain anything in your head. That information that you need comes to you at the point of need, right? So for me, the big things that I see on the horizon are the opportunities that artificial intelligence and big data will enable. And for me, big data is one of those areas where it allows you to mine stuff and identify micro segments. So all the need for segmentation can come from mining that data and identifying where the opportunity for leapfrogging is. And that is the opportunity that we have in Africa, because we tend not to build technologies. However, we're users of technologies. And once we understand how to convert those technologies, or how to interpret, how to identify the opportunities given our culture and the way we use them, we will create leapfrogging opportunities. And that's something that we have to keep an eye on. I'm going to end on this slide, which is to understand that there's some barriers to innovation. And technically, one of the ways to look at creating something new is that it's going to divert resources away from other things. So the question is, how do you do that when resources are limited? How do you embrace, the opportunity of being able to create change? My view is that the innovation will start in micro segments in other areas, and it will take a while before it reaches the policy level. Where you can roll out and change education on a national scale, right? But opportunities are there. If you look at, for example, the assets of educational establishments, say in Nigeria, and what they are worth, and the utility of that going forward, you will start to ask questions. Is there a better way to actually use that pent up value? So I think, I've shot over my time. So at this point, I will stop and I will address any questions that come after I've spoken. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ade. Thank you for that. And I think what I just want to add to what Ade said is sometimes as educationists and reformers in the sector, you can't do it alone. You need to collaborate with either money or or expertise in order to really scale up to leapfrog. We have many ideas, we have solutions, but if we're not partnering with the right people or collaborating, we just find ideas don't really go far. On our last, on part 4 of the webinar, we'll be discussing partnerships and collaborations, and we'll be sending you in the direction of tech funds, incubators, for those that wish to collaborate. Ade, who's just presented, runs one of those sort of vehicles, and there's so many other partners that will be coming on board that run such vehicles where we can try to pilot and scale up ideas. I think with that, I would like Ravinder to come on board. Ravinder, you go ahead, and then at the end, we'll take all the questions. Over to you, Ravinder.
So let me just start by saying hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share how we, as both a university, are trying to manage this crisis. I think the previous presentations have been very enlightening, and I'm trying to sort of put forth a case study using the organization where I work, which is both a university in Botswana. A quick background, we are the largest private tertiary institution in Botswana. We have about 4,000 students and presence in 4 countries, including Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini. And we also have a blended and distance learning campus. We offer undergraduate to postgraduate degrees across a wide range of disciplines, including practical programs such as engineering, hospitality, health, computing, etc. We are ISO 9001:2015 certified, and we have been rated as offering programs of good quality by the African Quality Rating Mechanism. I just wanted to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and how we have ensured continuity of learning. When COVID reached the Southern African shores, we had already started discussions on our preparedness and strategy. During extensive engagements with all our staff and stakeholders, one thing was very clear, that we all agreed that learning must continue at all costs. Given our foresight to have always invested into technology even before the pandemic, it seemed possible for us to ensure that we continue to fulfill our core mandate. All our processes were already automated thanks to a full-fledged ERP system that is heavily used. All our academic and non-academic staff at least had a basic standard of using technology, as that is how the university functions on a daily basis. Since we are also a provider of distance learning programs, we had content and teaching in place. What was different was that we always tried to integrate our learnings from the distance learning approach into our campus learning approach as well. So this was a massive advantage to us during this crisis, as most of our lecturers and administrators had already been exposed to delivering content virtually. We use Blackboard, a very well-known learning management system for both campus and distance learning students, and hence this method of education delivery was very well established. We've always been a very large bandwidth consumer, being a technology-driven institution, and we've also been able to provide learning devices to our students, such as laptops and tablets. Moving on, just a second. Yeah. I think with such measures in place as part of our long-term strategy, we found ourselves as one of the very few institutions locally with the ability to combat the pandemic. Our biggest success was our decision right back in 2008 when we decided to give laptops to our students. Frankly, this was an innovative approach to a dilemma we were facing on how to ensure that our students learn by doing, have a hands-on approach to learning, and gain as much practical experience as possible. Either we could invest into a large volume of staff who could deliver extended learning practical-based sessions, which we did, or we could invest into infrastructure by building large practice rooms such as the public universities have. Again, we did do certain some of that, but we decided that in the long term it would be beneficial for us to be giving learners their own learning devices, which means they learn anywhere, anytime. Given the risks associated, this was an unorthodox move back in 2008, but it has put us into a position of advantage today. Some of the other positive side effects of this move have been anecdotal evidence suggesting that there has been overall improvement in learner performance because learning is not restricted to their time on campus. We've got tremendous marketing benefits, of course, and basically we revolutionized the education sector in Botswana. Owning a laptop went from being a luxury to a prerequisite for quality education delivery, and we do take some credit for that. Next, having said that, we're very alive to the challenges we face on a day-to-day basis. Internet access is still a big challenge, and many students still do not have learning devices. Regulators have limited capacity to overnight quality assured distance learning and hence are sending mixed messages. Even government policy is constantly changing in response to the pandemic. And so institutions, learners, the entire education sector is not sure of the kind of support that we are going to get. Given that we offer a lot of practical programs, something that has been alluded to, online learning does have its challenges. Even though we offer a virtual lab, simulations, and share videos, it's just not the same. Academic calendars have been disrupted. The needs of students with special needs and other disadvantaged sectors of learning who need human interaction for effective learning must also not be forgotten. Lastly, there's the whole aspect that we operate in a small market and comparisons are inevitable with those who have not made the switch to online learning or do not have the capacity. I think students are questioning us to say, why are we continuing learning whereas others are not? Because they've been given extended breaks. Next, we also see the opportunity in this whole scenario. I think distance learning has been mainstreamed overnight. Literally, it can no longer be viewed as second fiddle to classroom-based teaching and learning. Telecom companies and ISPs are willing to consider whitelisting educational sites. They've actually done so. A move that was never possible in a normal world. New solutions and business ideas are emerging, and I think entrepreneurship is getting a boost. I think the world has also become a very open marketplace as graduates that are tech savvy or have adopted technology will be able to work across geographical locations and boundaries. In summary, I think we've embraced this disruption and used technology as our answer, and that is our message to other African providers as well. Online learning is a necessity, and keeping learners positively engaged at this point is extremely crucial. I mean, learner and tutor mindsets towards online learning have to change. Technology has to be integrated into curriculum delivery. And digital classrooms will probably be the way that we will be delivering education for a while until we can get back into normal classroom modes. However, in order to ensure that not all students get, some students don't get left behind, effective mitigation measures have to be devised to ensure that, those who have genuine reasons for not being able to cope with online learning are not disadvantaged. Traditional methods of assessments, of course, paper-based assessments where you have to see the person in front of you, those will have to be re-looked at. I just want to use this to answer a question I got earlier to say, I think in assessments is a very well-established concept in provision of distance learning. You do have projects, assignment-based, online quizzes. You also have the ability and technological tools to proctor exams online. And you have plagiarism detecting software that can show you whether you have plagiarized from other sources. But really, we have to review our traditional assessment methodology, and the regulator must also be willing to consider even participation and discussion forums as a valid way to gauge learner outcomes. Lastly, I think any platform to have a dialogue, discuss and learn from best practice must be welcomed. Research and funding must be open for long-term solutions, and data gathered must be widely shared and freely available to all. We're all in this together, and this is the time I feel that we have to collaborate rather than compete. So I thank you for your time and your attention. Happy for any questions.
Arinda, you've spoken quite a lot, and I just want to touch on two areas. And one takes us back to can you hear me? Yeah. One takes us back to last week when we spoke on policy and leadership. You have succinctly explained that you were prepared for the pandemic, more or less. You had a BCP, you had early warning signs and a sort of structure for that. Is that because you had good leadership at your organization level, or was that something being sort of channeled at a higher level, such as national, federal Ministry of Education, etc.? Could you just talk on that? Then secondly, I like the fact that you realize there are challenges in e-learning. And one of the things you have sort of alluded to here is the capacity of the instructor to kind of bring learning into reality. So the answer is, if I may summarize what you said, it's not in the e-learning tool, but it's the ability of the instructor to bring that learning into practical reality. And there, in essence, leads us to the importance of the teacher and instructor. That will be a conversation we'll be sharing next week when we're talking about learning, teaching and learning, and we'll focus more into that capacity. But for the benefit of the audience, could you just touch on the pandemic preparedness and the challenge you just articulated? If you can make it really brief in 90 seconds, please. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's a combination of both, Annie. We do have very good leadership, and being a private education provider, we are very aware of our limitations and our constraints. We do not have unlimited amount of funding, and so we try to maximize whatever resources we have. And being prepared and planned is one of the ways in which we combat any challenges. I must also talk about the regulatory and the environment that we operate in. Mostly in markets which are primarily government-sponsored students, and where students get bursaries. And so a lot of our decisions have to be influenced by what government is saying. But we are fortunately in markets where government has been supportive and allowed private enterprise to grow. But definitely it all comes down to leadership to say that where are we seeing ourselves in 10, 15 years from now? What are the resources that we have on hand, and how can we maximize them? Because being financially viable and being sustainable, we are not here for a day. We are not here to operate and close shop overnight. We are here to leave a legacy as a private education provider. We're also small. We run like a corporate, so we're very agile. We keep our eyes peeled to fluctuations in the market, and so we are able to bring the advantages of operating like a corporate, but into the education sector, which possibly many other large, possibly public institutions may find it a little hard to do. And I think that is where some of our key differentiators have come from. So yeah, I hope that kind of addressed your question.
I believe we're moving into questions. I want to quickly ask Ujam Clarice. She's from the Federal Ministry of Education in Nigeria. Ujam, you got the floor. Please make your question really succinct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you hear very much.
Yes, yes, we are. Please quickly introduce your name, organization, and country. Quick, please. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Clarice Ujam. I work with Federal Ministry of Education, Nigeria. It is really interesting that the COVID-19 is bringing out both innovation and creativity in man and introducing technology. Right now, it might be a bit difficult for everybody to key in, but I believe that with time, it's going to touch, everybody's going to get used to it. Education sector will not remain the same, and every other sector will not remain the same. But technology is actually exposing our cognitive domain of learning. But my concern is this, because there is this cognitive domain, there is affective domain, there is this psychomotor domain. What happens to the emotional aspect? What happens to the physical aspect of learning? It is also something that should give us concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll take another question real quick from Aki Fatuke. Can we have Aki on board? Or, yep. Maybe Ravinda, can you address the last question real quick? Because you've got experience, you've mentioned, can you just address the issue is really about psychosocial support. Could you address that real quick?
Yes, I was just saying that all of us have been thrown into this pandemic very suddenly. And even though we have had some strategies to mitigate the effects, it's been literally overnight that we've shifted. A big thing that we need to understand is that not everybody will appreciate the move to online learning the same way. And so there has to be a lot of communication and consultation and engagement at all levels of stakeholders, be it within the staff component, be it with the learners, be it with the parents, regulators, and the government. And I think in smaller markets, it's easily done, but I do believe that in most countries there are forums available for people to exchange their challenges and come up with solutions that can be cross-referenced from one sector to the other. And this is how we have also tried to address some of these challenges. We have also opened up a lot of counseling lines for our students by engaging with them through our student services departments. We have opened up platforms such as WhatsApp for students to share their problems with us. Lecturers have created WhatsApp groups for each of their batches, and students are allowed to privately message them if they have any concerns. But definitely it all goes down to continuous engagement and communication. And I think all of us need to be very flexible in our approach here to say that while we can take as many of our learners through this whole pandemic and ensure that teaching and learning continues, we should do that. But there will still be some who will get left behind. And so those have to be dealt with on a case-to-case basis with appropriate mitigation measures. But we should not throw in our towel to say, because we cannot do 100%, we will not do anything. And I think that's the flexibility in approach that we need to have at this time. Let us do something.
Yeah, I'm Derek Ansakwansa, a Ghanaian, but currently teaching in Cote d'Ivoire.
Welcome. Go ahead, please.
Go ahead. Yeah, I want to know about what about the kids in the rural areas, because especially in West Africa here, it's really difficult for students to have access to some basic amenities. So what about them? What can we do to help these kids out there? Because currently the government of Cote d'Ivoire is having this radio television system of teaching the kids, and some schools are also having some online platforms for the kids to have access to their teachers. But the problem is some are asking questions. We don't have phone, we don't have television. How do we have access to these programs?
Ezekiel, you can come on board now to share what you're doing at Could you quickly express what you're doing, Ezekiel?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I want to appreciate the other panel members I think they've done a fantastic job. Ade did justice to technology. What is left for telcos is basically to just come tie everything together. So telcos are basically just enablers. And with respect to the question, you heard us talk about radio. So each of the panel members have talked about a piece in the pie. And you're not going to get 100% delivery through one particular channel. And unfortunately, we talk about the digital divide. Yes, you're going to have to use radio. You're going to have to use television. You're going to have to use mobile solution that you can make do on a feature phone, which is basically you can dial into a content provider. You can listen to teaching. You really don't have to be restricted to a smartphone. So you're going to have bits and pieces of that. And I'm going to talk to you about, just briefly, about what MTN is currently doing about fixing a very little solution, even in the urban areas, where you hear people talk about the challenge of data. So organizations, schools, institutions can now sponsor their sites such that their students can access content for free. So it is more like, when we used to have toll-free lines. This one is toll-free. So the organization comes to MTN, and MTN whitelists. I think Ava had mentioned that, so the organization will just whitelist that URL for you, that website, and your students can then access this website, this content, without having data. But as you move towards the rural areas, you start to depend less on smartness of the device to how mobile the device can be. And that is where we work together with all other ecosystem of providers to ensure that contents are available through other means. And I'd mentioned that we've talked about radio here, we talked about TV. We can actually do that also on the phone to take care of at least a portion of their learning. I think that answers that question. But just again, to talk about the need to have increased focus on whatsoever solution we're going to have, whether you're in Cote d'Ivoire, you're in Nigeria, or you're in any other part of Africa. It's collaboration. And I hear all the panel members talk about collaboration. Not one single industry can take care of this. We have to come together. There must be a will and there must be execution. Once you have that, I think you're fine.
I want to ask other people to keep it short. Faith Musiu, can you please talk now?
Hi, my name is Faith Musiu from Dignitas Limited in Kenya. I have 2 questions. One, how can we measure the impact of learning on radio? And 2, how can we practically ensure that children are not left behind in either the radio program or the content that we have? What are some of the best practices that others have seen out there so that we can be able to learn and try and implement the same? Thank you.
Can I have Fabian George? Fabian, your question?
This is Fabian George from Namibia. Basically, the challenges that we are facing as nations is that we need to ensure that every student from everywhere is able to access to the devices or the solutions that we are providing. And so far as we have seen, people are talking about the radio. Yes, there are chances that the radio can cover all the areas within different countries, but there are also chances that it may not cover some learning outcomes. There are students that may not hear, and therefore they would need to see, and that opportunity may not be created by the radio. If we also come to the technology that we have indicated, such as the mobile telephone, yes, mobile telephone can be able to solve the problems, but we also discover that there are chances that there are specific places where mobile network may not be available. And therefore that creates again another challenge. What I think should then be done is to ensure that different solutions should be created to ensure that everyone within the educational system can be able to access the information.
Okay, so Fabian, because of time, can I have those 2 questions quickly addressed by Mansu and Aziz, real quickly, please? The question raised by Faith, and there's also a question raised by Fabian. Could you just address us in as short as possible? Then I'll take the next set of questions.
I think, if I may, question. It was asking about measuring the impact on radio. There are lots of studies that have been done, but I think the shortest answer is a combination of using a combination with other methods, because you have to combine other methods in order to make sure that some of the key learning has been impacted. Radio is sometimes a one-way method if you don't use other forms of communication in order to get a feedback. If it is asynchronous, then you could ask students to actually record what they have and then get back. That's by asking them questions and they're recording the answers back, and then you can assess that. But if you want to do synchronous, then you have to combine either feature phones and using text messages in order to get what you want and get feedback from the students. I think that's the simplest answer I can give.
Yeah, I can add that. Yeah, I agree completely with you. There is no magical solution for this kind of questions, you know, especially for technology also. When internet is provided, we can use online courses, and it's not difficult to assess students, online quizzes, etc., etc. But perhaps in some kind of situations, I'm remembering in the 90s, we have started doing some kind of distance learning, and we were providing rural areas with recorders and tapes, and also the written handouts. And students can write their answers and do their homework in some kind of sheets. And then there is, in fact, there is no one solution for this kind. So it depends on the situation, and that's all.
Ravinder, add to your conversation.
In India, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a model called as correspondence, where the postal service was used to deliver materials to remote areas, and learners would fill in the worksheets and then send it back. I think it's not too late for us to reinvent those models and adopt them to this scenario, because they worked, and for a very long time when technology was not so advanced in India, this is the way that learned and actually got formal qualifications of repute. I think this is another opportunity that Professor Aziz was mentioning, to bring back that model of correspondence for very remote areas where there's no radio, no TV, none of that. So it'll have to be a combination.
I'll take the next set of quickly. That's a child at home, obviously, disruption. Quick one here is a question of how do we quickly scale up to recover the lost time when we're able to go back to school. So I'd like people to start thinking about that and answering those questions. And may I have Ms. Adebunuju now quickly make her contributions, and Aki Fatunke board in line.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Buki Adebonojo, and I'm calling you from Lagos. I'm also director for Axiom Learning Solutions, we're a learning and development company. I think for me, the question really, and I'm not sure if we have, we don't have all the answers, but how then do we use technology to teach children that have special needs, teach and assess them, and what other ideas, how can we innovate and, technology to be able to properly carry these children along, children with special needs? That's my question. Thank you.
Aki Fatunke, just ask your question real quick. We haven't got much time, so Aki Fatunke.
It's just a question to say that Nigeria, like many other countries, I like to say with all sense of responsibility that COVID-19 is an eye-opener. I think perhaps COVID-19 has come, and the kind of disruptions that the panelists have discussed, this just seems to be talking to Nigeria to open our eyes. Like Ayo has said, our attitudes, the technical and the markets should expand. I like a situation where we borrow hands-on from what is happening in Finland. The way the syllabus goes is such that you spend some time in school, you spend quite a number of times out of school. Mr. Ademonojo just asked a very valid question about, the physically challenged and the underserved. This is a time for us to rejig our syllabus and curriculum so that people can go to some of those homes and go and get the education. Now, talking about radio, I do a lot of radio. I'm not a journalist. I worked in ExxonMobil for 26 years. I'm in public affairs. I'm a chartered accountant. A lot of learning is going on in radio in Nigeria today, especially in areas of Lagos. We can expand that. BBC since April 4, 1924, I think we could just expand that. Those malams or the people you see.
So, Akib, I really get you. Your issue is that how do we expand and scale up. I'm also seeing a lot of conversations, again, is addressed to Mansoor. How can we, again, lots of questions in the Q&A section around assessment, questions around how you could partner. And there's a question about how do you address competition of airtime that would generate revenue? How do you address that in order to be to remain solvent, particularly in these times? Perhaps you could really touch on that right quickly. Thank you, Mansoor.
I think that's really a very difficult one to balance, because, I mean, even for the publicly, financed radio stations, it's a struggle getting the funding from the government, and so there is a lot of dependence on getting private sponsorships. So really getting a balance between what you can give the government and then what you can, give in terms of, sponsorship is going to be very difficult. But I think when you are faced with situations like this pandemic, there is a national emergency that is involved. And so this is not everything that is about money. Something you have to look at for social responsibility and make sure that I think you sustain the whole education sector of the, or you contribute your own quota in sustaining the education for future generations. So that's, I think, what one needs to do. It's not everything that's about money. So yes, there is that competition, but I think if you factor the social responsibility aspect, then you would have to do something about it. And this is what we're trying to do with the Ministry of Education at the moment.
So we're coming to the end of this because we really must stick to time, I'm afraid. There are lots of conversation, and I really want us to encourage us to take some of those questions and conversations offline on our Twitter handles. Valentine, you could share the Twitter and social media handles as you wind down in another 3 minutes. So the conversations can continue on social media. And next week, someone did mention Finland. Perhaps there might be someone from Finland talking about teaching on our teaching and learning experience. It's 12:42, so I'm just going to round up and ask each of the contributors on this distinguished panel just to surmise in 45 seconds their thoughts on technology and innovation. So I'll start with ladies, and the only lady on the panel from South Africa, from Botswana, Aravinda.
Yes, thank you. It's been a very wonderful opportunity for me to be part of this esteemed group of individuals. And I think from my side, I had already summarized earlier. I think I'm just going to repeat myself to say that we have to do our best to ensure that learning can continue. In scenarios of lockdown where people are sitting in isolation, a lot of depressing thoughts can come to you, and that can have some unwanted social effects. So it's very important to restore and give people a sense of hope, a sense of normalcy, and being part of an education system, having classes, using technology to meet with your friends and with your lecturers, to have something productive to do at the end of the day is very important. And I think teaching and learning is a very vital component of that. And hence, I'm propagating to say that we must do what we can. We don't have all the answers at this stage, but this is an evolving discussion. Not even the first world countries know what they are doing. So I think what needs to happen is these kind of discussions, and our responses will change every day. We'll get newer problems, and we'll have to just be flexible to say, today I said this, and tomorrow I'm going to say something different. But that's not because I'm fickle, that's just because I'm being evolutionary. And I think that's just the right way to approach this pandemic. Thank you.
We need to keep it short. Ade, you next. Please keep it as short as possible, 45 seconds.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And thank everyone for the questions. I just want to address opportunity at the bottom of the pyramid, and I'm going to focus on radio as a channel. It's important to understand that innovation opens up as the more you think about it. So for me, when you think about the role of a teacher, the teacher's role is not just instruction. So one of the things that radio does is that it allows you to get that instruction without the mediation of the teacher in front of the kids. However, there could be another individual present where those children are concerned, who deal with things like the attention of the kids, their understanding, their ability to get feedback. So really the way to innovate past the stuff at the bottom of the pyramid is to combine solutions that exist elsewhere and to understand what a teacher does and how to break that up and introduce new individuals who can take on various other aspects. I thank you.
Thank you. Aziz, you really need to keep it 30 seconds now. What's your closing statement? So I'd ask Aziz, Mansour, and Ezekiel to prepare your closing statements, not lasting more than 30 seconds, please. Thank you.
I want to end up with it's not a joke, but yesterday I was talking with some colleagues, and the question how to handle with the person with disabilities or with special needs. And we were all saying that in this situation, all of us were people with some special needs, even me as a normal person, but in quarantine since almost 1 month, I got outside for a couple of times. I have some special needs now. So it's really very difficult to have a special state about which technology, how to deal with. It's a new situation. We are all experimenting new methods, new things to deal with. And I will sum up and end up with that ICISCO, as other NGOs, are here to support countries to deal with this pandemic. So feel free to contact me, to contact our organization if there is some kind of support that we can provide to you. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Aziz. Mansour, I think you've got 10 seconds now, I'm sorry.
Enough to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and then, to learn from other people too. But I think what this has shown us is that it's a challenge for all of us when we are faced with things like this. And I will end with what Ade says: there is no one model that fits all. I think it's a combination of things that will be able to solve our problems. Thank you very much.
Well done, Mansour. Ezekiel?
Yeah, thanks everyone. I just want to encourage everyone facing this challenge. Be strategic. Don't be in a panic to want to find solution. We're all in it together. We're finding solutions together. Look out for the education suite that MTN just launched. It will help you, and it will change the way you go to market with respect to education. Thank you very much, everyone.
Ezekiel, I think I'll ask you offline to kind of present that next week, because we're talking about teaching and learning. So for everyone on this call, MTN will have an opportunity maybe to do a demo and maybe talk about CSR opportunities for us in that regard on our call next week. So do go ahead and share a lot with your colleagues and network. It's been an absolute pleasure having you all. I now hand over to our wonderful compere, Mr. Valentin Ohu, who's going to take us through the last rounds of housekeeping. But before I do that, perhaps it's just interesting to just talk about that poll that we had shared. Do you think tech firms are responding positively, appropriately to the needs of education in Africa? 66% felt it could be better. What areas lack the application of technology? Initially at the beginning of the call, it was assessment, but it has swapped now to 41% thinking that teaching is an area that lacks the application of technology, and 36% feeling that would be assessment. Do you think governments in Africa are concerned about developing technology? And 50% felt it could be better. Do you think technology in education will actively positively affect positively early learners? 89% felt yes, and for special needs, about 90%. And for the last question was, do you think governments in Africa are concerned about developing technology to enhance education? And the answers were showing yes. So I think it shows that we really are having a very collaborative and progressive conversation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Over to a wonderful compare, Valentine Ohu.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being part of this. It's my honor to be part of this and host and compare this event. I want to especially thank all the contributors, especially our panelists. I'll start, so ladies first. So I'll start with Mrs. Aravinda Ram from Botswana. Thank you for joining us. Professor Aziz El Hajir from Morocco. Thank you. Mr. Mansour Liman, thank you very much, my senior colleague. And of course, Mr. Ezekiel Bamiboye, and special thanks to Mr. Ezekiel. Mr. Ezekiel Bamiboye, Mr. Ade Adekola, Special thanks to all of you. And for everybody who joined in from Nigeria, Uganda, United Nations, Namibia, Ghana, France, Mali, Rwanda, North Cyprus, thank you so much. Remember, our next session will be on the 5th of May, May 5. Same time, 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. We'll endeavor to be on time. Then we'll discuss teaching and learning. It will be part 3 of this series, Disruption and Innovation, Reshaping Education in Africa post-COVID-19. So May 5th, 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. on Teaching and Learning Part 3. Emails will be circulated to all participants and panelists ahead of that event. Please remember to continue this conversation on social media at Axiom Learn NG, Axiom Learn NG. And also note that any views and opinions shared in this conference does not represent the views of Axiom Learning Solutions or any other organization. Special thanks to all of you again. My name is Valentino. Have yourselves a lovely week.